No. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you? Yes. Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Right. So let's do the last lecture. It's probably a shorter one than the others. So tonight we're going to speak about William Harvey and the circulation of blood. And according to the editors of this book, Medicine's Greatest Discoveries, this would be the best discovery. But if you remember, when I did my introduction, I spoke about Vesalius, the anatomist, or the father of anatomy. Now, I must say that many people cannot decide between who really started experimental medicine. Was it Harvey or Vesalius? They were both very good. Vesalius was particularly interested, as you'll remember, in bones and skeletons. That's why he was a grave robber. Harvey was more interested in the circulation of blood. So, which of these breakthrough achievements was the most important? Harvey's elucidation of the functions of the heart and the circulation of blood in the human body, because he introduced the principle of experimentation for the first time in medicine. He also recognized that the body and its parts moved, that life itself was a series of movements. Okay, so let's just do a bit of history again. The heart in Egyptian, Greek, and Roman times. Thousands of years before Harvey, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans were aware of a beating heart. It was dominant in their spiritual and emotional activities. If humans possessed a soul, it resided in the reddish mass that pounded perpetually in one's chest. And when the beating stopped, the soul vanished. So arteries in corpses had air because upon death, arteries contract and expel their blood into veins. So what was known, even probably later than this, is that oxygen-rich blood enters the heart from the lungs and goes out to the body, and oxygen-poor blood enters the heart from the body and goes out to the lungs. Now remember, when we're talking about the heart, you're talking about it as if I'm facing the other day. So that would be the left side of the heart, and that would be the right side. Okay, so this is the man we're talking about. Born in 1578 and died in 1657. Now, he left behind this amazing piece of work called De Mortu Cordis. And we ought to be very grateful that it survived, because most of his documentation was lost in a fire, which I'll tell you about just now. But three of the greatest books in English were published in the first third of the 17th century. King James's authorized version of the Bible in 1611, the folio edition of Shakespeare's plays, 1623, the English translation of William Harvey's, and it's this long thing, but they call it for short De Mortu Cordis in 1628. What the authorized version of the Bible has been to the Church of England and the Shakespeare folio to the English literature, De Mortu Cordis has been to medicine everywhere. So it's been amazing. Okay. But as I said to you, and I have to go back to Galen, because Galen and his life and his work directly impinges on Harvey. So Galen, as you know, lived in the 2nd century and the 3rd century. Harvey was not the first to show interest in blood circulation. This man, who for short was called Galen and better known as Galen of Pergamon, was a Greek physician, surgeon, and philosopher in the Roman Empire. Now, Galen in the 2nd and 3rd century, and then he was around 14 centuries before Harvey. Harvey lived in the 16th and the 17th century. So whilst for most of Galen's observations and concepts were accepted, his work on the structure and function of the heart and the arteries and veins remained a fantasy until came along the likes of William Harvey. The problem with it is, and something I don't understand is, firstly, why this gap of so many centuries before somebody else took up this kind of anatomy and the circulation again? That's one thing I can't understand. The other thing is, as I said in my introduction, and I'll probably say it here too just now, is that those who followed Galen and those who were in between Galen and Harvey were all very frightened of actually criticizing Galen. I don't know why. I don't understand.
The church?
Partly. But I mean, by then the Roman Empire had already gone. So.
By the 2nd century, Christianity was.
Yes, but 17th century, 16th century, the church was still strong. But I mean, science by then had been moving. You had Copernicus, you had Galileo. Isaac Newton was born in 1642. So science was moving, and we had all these philosophers of science, like Descartes and company. So it is a bit intriguing. So, blood circulation according to Galen, 130 to 210. In his theory on the circulatory system, Galen explained that blood circulates from the heart to the lungs, and from the heart to the rest of the body, from the right heart to the lung, and then back to the left heart. That he called the lesser circulation. And in that he was perfectly right. And it's very likely that he was able to observe this in injured soldiers in the Roman Empire. So it was a revolutionary discovery. And he observed that the right side, or the right atrium, which is this part here, of the heart, received deoxygenated blood from the large veins emptying into it. And there you're talking about this large vein here, called the superior vena cava, and this large vein here, called the inferior vena cava. Now this one brought blood back from the head region and the upper thorax to the heart, and this one brought back from the rest of the body below the heart. And all that blood came into the right atrium. He was perfectly right. And of course you know from your metric biology that arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood. The surprising thing is that when blood comes into the atrium, which is this top right compartment of the heart, then it flows into the ventricle, right? When it's still deoxygenated. When it leaves the ventricle to go to the lungs, to either side, to both lungs, it goes via an artery. That's the only time in which an artery is transporting deoxygenated blood. Okay? So that's very interesting. Now, Galen observed that the right side of the heart received deoxygenated blood from the large veins, and that this blood was then ejected by the right ventricle into the lungs via the pulmonary artery. He further observed that the lungs drained this oxygenated blood into the left side of the heart. Right? So that blood came back oxygenated now. So your blood goes into the lungs, right? And it's in the pulmonary artery. Okay? Now, between arteries and veins, you get capillaries. They're like little bridges, and they're very tiny. So arteries and veins can exchange blood through capillaries. Now, what happens there is that once the blood gets into the capillaries in the lung, oxygen can seep into those capillaries and oxygenate the blood. Okay? And now that blood is oxygenated and can return to the heart, and it's the only time when oxygenated blood is transported by a vein, and in this case, a pulmonary vein. So this pulmonary veins, this is the left one and that's the right one, come back to the left heart, to the left atrium, and then into the ventricle. Okay? So he further observed that the lungs drained this oxygenated blood into the left side of the heart, which in turn pumped it into the aorta. And this is the big artery, your aorta. The major blood vessel leaving the left ventricle to all parts of the body. This was all made possible by the fact that the heart was essentially a mass of muscles whose contraction pumped blood to and through the lungs into the aorta. The heart is a pump, and arteries carry blood, not air. You know, why I'm laughing is that when Chris Barnard did the heart transplant, and, you know, the whole world reacted to it. And, you know, there were a lot of people said, how can he do that? That's the seat of the soul. And then he one day, in frustration, responded, it's just a bloody pump, man. So, you know, that's the story. And that's how scientists think. I mean, they don't have all these poetic approaches to life. So, you know, one has got to really commend Galen, because this is the 2nd century AD. And he actually knew this, which is remarkable. What he probably didn't know, and what they didn't know even for a long time, and I don't think Harvey knew even 14 centuries later, that oxygen which is now carried, oxygenated blood, is actually in your red blood cells bound to your hemoglobin. And the other day we spoke about how proteins are made. And you will never forget that the information for making a protein is in your DNA. And that information is transcribed into your RNA, which then decides on the kind of protein that will be formed, depending on the sequence of the amino acids. And I showed you a picture of hemoglobin. It's got 4 subunits, 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. What I didn't tell you is, when you say hemoglobin, it's the globin part of that molecule, which is a protein. The heme is a prosthesis. It's like a prosthetic leg, but it's very small, and it sits in the center of the molecule, and bound to it, it has an iron atom, Fe2+. Iron. Okay? And that iron is oxidized. That means it loses an electron to become Fe3+, and it can bind the oxygen in the lungs. So now that hemoglobin that is embracing this iron molecule is in your red blood cells, and those cells are being transported by this blood in the aorta to every part of your body. So when it binds that oxygen, it has a particular conformation, that hemoglobin molecule, right? When it gets, so in the lungs, it has bound the oxygen in conditions of high partial pressure of oxygen, because you're breathing in oxygen. So your lungs have a high partial pressure of oxygen, right? And the hemoglobin binds this oxygen and it embraces it, but it's carried by a non-protein molecule that is sitting right in the middle of that hemoglobin, which is a prosthesis. It's not a protein. It's called a heme. It's a chemical structure. Okay? And to that heme is bound this Fe2+, which has to be in the form of Fe3+. That means it has to lose an extra electron. And it binds that oxygen, and then that transport to all parts of the body takes place. This is absolutely remarkable. When it gets to your periphery, so it's moving away from the heart, and it's going to all parts of the body. As it goes further and further away from the heart, it is in a region of a low partial pressure of oxygen, and it detects that. You know, sometimes I used to wonder, do these molecules have brains? How on earth do they know what to do? So they come to your peripheral parts of the body, and it feels that it's in an environment of low partial pressure of oxygen. Right? So what does it do? It hands over the oxygen to your tissue. And that oxygen goes into all your cells, right? And you've eaten glucose, it oxidizes the glucose, breaks it down in steps in these beautiful pathways called glycolysis. That means the breaking down of glucose. It goes into the citric acid cycle, right? It breaks down that glucose gently and slowly. And each time you're breaking that glucose, you are releasing energy, because that glucose is your food, it's your energy. And that energy is being trapped in the cell until all the glucose is broken down and converted to the currency of energy in your body, which is ATP. That's why I can stand here and do this. Or I can see you and my brain is processing it. You can hear my voice, your brain is processing it. You are using ATP. So who do you thank? You thank your lungs, you thank the oxygen in the air, you thank your red blood cells, you thank your hemoglobin. Now when that hemoglobin takes this oxygen to a distal part of the body, and it feels or it detects that it is in an area of low partial pressure, right? It does a shift. It actually changes conformation. What is that? That's movement. That is energy. And the oxygen is released. But when it's made that shift in conformation, it becomes receptive to the binding of carbon dioxide which the tissue have produced after breaking down the glucose. That carbon dioxide now binds to the hemoglobin, which comes back now via the venous circulation to the right side of the heart, back to the lungs, right, to be oxygenated, and you breathe out the carbon dioxide. This is the most remarkable thing in the world. This is science. That's why I cried when you didn't want to hear about DNA and RNA and proteins. This is science. This is beautiful. And look at this, 2nd century. He must have been a madman, or he must have had a visitation from the Lord. I mean, he worked this out, but he didn't know about red blood cells and hemoglobin and that kind of thing. But he gave us the first general plan. But what he did is, his focus was on the heart. He must have seen, he never admitted it, he must have seen somebody with an open chest wound. And he must have seen a beating heart. And he copped on and he worked this out. Remarkable.
The electron that gets lost by the hemoglobin, how does it recover that electron?
Which electron?
And you said that the iron.
Those electrons are around to go and reduce something else. Nothing's ever wasted, right? But that iron has to be in an Fe3+ form. So when something leaves one thing, it's used by something else for an opposite function. So in your body is so remarkably designed that you don't really lose anything, okay, in chemical terms. Okay, so Galen's other ideas. He was able to link the pulse in the arteries to the contractions of the left ventricle, and he realized that veins have valves to prevent the backflow of blood. This was, for me, Dr. Darcy, this was for me his other major discovery. Because you always wonder, if I'm standing, how on earth is blood coming back from my toes right up against the force of gravity, and why doesn't it flow back? This was a question asked by the surgeons here at Groote in the J.S. Murray, where Chris Barnard and Hamilton Naki work. Robert Goods and others, the question they asked was, when a giraffe stretches out and picks something off a tree, right? And then it comes down and then it goes to a watering hole and it does this, right? that, and then picks its head up again, that rush of blood down, why doesn't the giraffe faint? Because it's got a long neck, so there must be a very speedily rush down its neck, because it's got valves in its blood vessels, which actually make sure that the blood doesn't flow too fast. Now here in your veins you have valves which ensure that the blood that is being pumped up towards your heart don't flow back. Okay? So he thought that holes in the septum, now this was his greatest error. And then let me just go back. He really thought that in between these chambers, there were holes in the septum. And so you could exchange blood between these two sides. Now that's a huge error, because in one side you've got oxygenated blood and in the other deoxygenated. In fact, the communication between these two compartments is via the lungs. And it's not, if you have a hole in the septum, you're very sick. I know of children who were born with these holes, and it was the most surprising thing, Dot. I think it was your friend at Red Cross who did an operation on one of my relatives. And he actually said that those holes, although he was born with them, can heal by themselves, but you have to operate, because during the period when the hole is there, the child's life is vulnerable. John Lawrenson, eh? Yeah. Okay, so it is very likely that Galen made his observations directly during injuries to soldiers experienced during the war. But he always pretended that it was animal vivisection, because the church was very much against any kind of human. So you had these 14 centuries between Galen and Harvey, but there were others in between. And you know what's the surprising thing is? Nobody wanted to contradict Galen. If they found that they made an observation that was directly in contradiction to Galen, they would pretend it wasn't there, or they would say it, but they would praise Galen. So Galen was still right. So now here was this man, Michael Servetus, 1506. So that's many centuries later. Also known as that, long name, was a Spanish theologian, a physician, cartographer, and a Renaissance humanist. He was an expert at dissections of the human body and a knowledge of the work of Galen second to none. So he had read Galen and he knew Galen's work very well. Now, he improved on Galen. So Galen did set the scene. The pulmonary artery carrying blood from the right heart to the lung was too huge to carry blood to nourish only the lung. Okay? Its size indicated that it carried all the blood of the body to the lungs. It wasn't just heart. You see, Galen hadn't seen the total picture. So he says its size, the size of the pulmonary artery that went from the right ventricle to the lungs, carried all the blood of the body to the lungs, so that the lungs could alter the blood itself. That means the lungs could oxygenate the blood. There were no pores in the septum separating the right and left ventricles. So he said that was a big error by Galen. The only way blood in the right ventricle could reach the left side of the heart was by transit through the pulmonary artery and the lung. And this was published in 1553. So here he has stood on the shoulders of the giant Galen, and he has seen further. Now, Servetus did something very stupid, which I can't imagine anybody would do. He published this in a 1546 manuscript with its precious anatomical and physiological discoveries. But the manuscript was not only scientific, it had more to do with his heretical views on the nature of the Trinity and the significance of the act of baptism. So he had doubts about religion and what it preached. In his enthusiasm, he sent a copy to John Calvin. Now, John Calvin was one of the successors of Martin Luther, a strong Protestant and a very strong Christian, Calvin was horrified, not by the science as much as the heresy, and castigated Servetus. And he did not return Servetus's manuscript. Calvin had eventually had Servetus burnt at the stake on the 22nd of October, 1553. Yeah. Who? Calvin. No, Servetus actually went to Switzerland, I think. That's where Calvin was. And he, you see, he didn't show, it is in this book. He didn't seem to be afraid. And he was seen by somebody, and Calvin was informed, and he said, arrest him. It's written in here somewhere. Okay, so I didn't want to give you the whole story because you thought I thought that you thought I'm starting to go into religion. Okay, so there were other pre-Harvey pioneers. There was Realdo Colombo, 1515 to 1559. He was a celebrated Paduan anatomist. He was a contemporary of Servetus and knew his work, but he never gave Servetus any credit. Before posthumous publication in 1559 in De Re Anatomica, which is a posthumous publication, he confirmed the pulmonary circulation of blood, plus discovered the presence of valves in the 4 vessels entering and leaving the left and right ventricles of the heart. Now it's getting very sophisticated, because once the left ventricle contracts and the blood goes into the aorta and it's oxygenated and it's going to all parts of the body, down there, you don't want it to flow back into the ventricle. So you got valves present in the aorta, you got valves in the pulmonary artery, you got valves in pulmonary veins, just to ensure that the blood moves in the right direction and doesn't flow back. Also, these vessels permitted the flow of blood in one direction only, right ventricles to lungs and back to left ventricle to aorta. He confirmed systole and diastole. Systole is the contraction of the heart. Diastole is when it relaxes so that it can fill up again. Systole, contract, diastole, relax. Pulmonary vein from the lungs to the left ventricle carries no air, he said, only blood. Okay, so these are improvements. And then there was Andreas Cecil Pino of Pisa. Must have come across Colombo's De Re Anatomica, but did not acknowledge it. Another one. Each one came and pretended as if they were doing the work for the first time. Published his own book in 1571, confirming pulmonary circulation. Colombo fails to acknowledge Servetus and Cecil Pino, fails to acknowledge either of them. The rootlessness of the post-Renaissance scientists. There were 2 errors. He failed to understand the direction of blood flow even when closure of vein caused the distension below the pressure point. If I give you a tourniquet here, you will see a bump in your vein there. The vena cava carried blood from and not to the heart. So he made some contributions. And then there was this man, Ala al-Din Abu al-Hasan Ali bin Abi Hazm al-Qarshi al-Dimashqi, known simply as Ibn al-Nafis, an Arab physician from Damascus, mostly famous for being the first to describe the pulmonary circulation of the blood. He did it independently. Okay. Now, what Khalili says, Jimal Khalili says on al-Nafis, is that evidence uncovered in the Berlin Library in 1924 showed conclusively that the groundwork for blood circulation was laid by the Syrian physician and polymath, Ibn al-Nafis. He was the first to describe the pulmonary transit, the transport of blood from the right side of the heart to the left via the lungs. Galen believed that the right to left movement was due to tiny pores in the septum separating the 2 sides, as I told you. His work, and he's talking about al-Nafis's work, called Shar Tashri al-Qanun. It's a commentary on anatomy in Ibn Sina's canon. So this is in Arabic, which was translated into Latin, must have been known to the 16th century physicians Michael Servetus, Andreas Vesalius, Rinaldo Colombo, all of who were to influence William Harvey. Okay, so there's the history of circulation. Galen in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Harvey in the 16th and 17th centuries, and in between them you had Michael Servetus, Rinaldo Colombo, Andreas Cesalpino, and Girolamo Fabricius, who was Harvey's teacher. And, of course, Ibn al-Nafis, who was earlier than all of them, but who wasn't very well known. Okay, enter William Harvey. Now, this is Fabricius, by the way, it is not Harvey. So Fabricius succeeded Colombo at Padua. He described the valves in the human veins. So each one is confirming the previous one's work and also adding a bit on. He taught 21-year-old William Harvey, who was fascinated by valves, did not know the function of these valves. This recognition came to William Harvey several decades later. And when he did, he began to unravel the puzzle of the passage of blood to all parts of the human body. That's the jump from Galen to Harvey, that Harvey took that heart and he studied and followed its function to every part of the body. Okay, so today we know that this is the superior vena cava, we know that's the inferior vena cava, and we know that blood, deoxygenated blood, comes from those two, and then from here it goes to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. It gets oxygenated in the lungs. It comes back to the left side of the heart. It goes into the ventricle, and then it's pumped out into the aorta as oxygenated blood to all parts of the body. And we owe it to all of them, from Galen to Servetus to Colombo to Fabricius to William Harvey. But Harvey, he was born in 1578 in Folkestone, near Dover. He was the eldest of 7 brothers. He was brilliant and awarded a scholarship to Caius for an undergrad degree. Caius is at Cambridge, his college at Cambridge. The college was given 2 hanged criminals per year for dissection. How very lucky.
For the criminals or for him?
For both. Harvey goes to Padua, and Vesalius and Colombo held the chair of anatomy. He became Fabricius's assistant, and he returned to London after his diploma. Okay. Personality-wise, he was aloof, says his admirer, the medical historian Geoffrey Keynes. And John Aubrey says John Aubrey was a historian. He was choleric and ever ready to reach for his dagger. Okay. Harvey's marriage. See, Harvey was clever. He married well. He married Elizabeth Brown. Her dad was the personal physician to Queen Elizabeth. Harvey was accepted as the Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. Now, I don't know whether that was because of his achievements or because he was married into a high family. He, in turn, attended to James I. He did his autopsy, and later to Charles I. He gave the Royal College's Lumley lectures since 1616. Now, that's an honor, to be asked to give the royal lectures. He told John Aubrey, the gossip historian, Europeans know not how to order or govern their women. The Turks were the only people who used them wisely. He was certainly not a feminist. Okay. Mrs. Harvey, very little is known about her. We do know that she owned a parrot. And Harvey dissected the parrot, which died from a decaying egg in the oviduct. And he actually also worked on animals without anaesthetics, right? So he was quite a cruel man. He didn't put animals to sleep before he worked on them. There's a portrait of Mrs. Harvey and the parrot, but it was destroyed by the fire of 1907. She had a very unhappy marriage because he was always absent and very aloof. He was more a scientist than a clinician. He claimed that the breast tumor disappeared when stroked with the cold hand of a corpse. So this is Harvey. He preceded present-day medical thinking when he eradicated another tumor by cutting off its blood supply. Now that is science. So at one stage, he says if you stroke the breast tumor with somebody's dead hand, it gets cured, which is nonsensical. But then he preceded present-day medical thinking when he eradicated another tumor by cutting off its blood supply. Now, tumors are very clever, as you know. They actually can perform this function called angiogenesis. So what a tumor does is it directs your blood supply to it. So it receives a lot of oxygen and a lot of nutrients so it can grow, because it grows wildly. And then it metastasizes when it breaks away. So angiogenesis, there's a lot of people who tried to actually do research on how to prevent a tumor from directing blood supply to itself, thinking that if they cut off its blood supply, it would kill off the tumor. And that research is still ongoing. But that Harvey, thought of it then. He looked for certain blemishes on women to prove that they were witches. So he was quite a mixture. Okay, his personal belongings were destroyed in 1642 by Oliver Cromwell's soldiers. 1642 is the year in which Isaac Newton was born. Again in 1666, by the huge London fire that burned the library of the Royal College of Physicians, he lost all his personal and scientific papers and books, except De Motu Cordis. We have De Motu Cordis and 2 other books. His Lumley anatomical lectures given to physicians of the Royal College are now in the British Museum. Though described as divine and immortal, he never got the presidency of the Royal College because of his personality. Okay? Right, so we rely on Robert Boyle, who's the founder of modern chemistry, John Aubrey, who's an unreliable historian, and Sir George Ent, his medical disciple, to tell us more and more about his personal life. Okay? And he reminisces to John Aubrey that his biggest regret was not the loss of his wife, but the loss in 1642 of his notes for a book on insects. This was the greatest crucifying that he endured in his entire life. I can imagine that when I lose a book, I go ballistic. He had dissected hundreds of species. Okay? And George Ent realized the importance of his experimental collection on the embryo. And it was published in 1651. And there was a totally new concept that all life originated from and first developed in an egg or ovum, confirmed in 1827 when Carl Bayer discovered the ovum in the human ovary. So he made an enormous, a momentous prediction. Okay, in his last years he was looked after by his wealthy brother Eliab, who had a male servant and kept a pretty young wench to wait on him, which I guess he made use for warmth's sake, as King David did, says John Aubrey. He died in 1657. He was buried in a vault in Hampstead Church in Essex. And that was broken in two, and his body was exposed to rain and rocks hurled by youngsters. So they moved his remains to Westminster Abbey. Now, so this is the book here, and it's worth a read because it goes into quite a bit of detail about him. Now, this book, as I said, I just want to say a little about the book. It has 10 chapters, right? So it has Andreas Vesalius and modern human anatomy, right? And it has Harvey. And the authors couldn't decide who was the greater man, but eventually I think Harvey won. Then they had Anthony Leeuwenhoek and bacteria, Edward Jenner and vaccination, Crawford Long and surgical anesthesia, which we did last night, William Röntgen and the X-ray beam, Ross Harrison and tissue culture, Nikolai Anichkov and cholesterol, Fleming and antibiotics, and Maurice Wilkins and DNA, which we have done. Okay, now, they ask, did any of these 10 discoveries evolve from another? Is there some kind of sequence here in this book? Yes, certainly. If Vesalius had not discovered and described quite accurately the constituents of the human body, Harvey 75 years later, could not have made much sense of the heart as an integrated functioning organ, and the network of arteries and veins would have appeared as something else. The 8 great discoveries that chronologically followed Harvey's could not have occurred if Harvey himself had not introduced the principle of experimentation in medical inquiry. So he is regarded as the first experimenter. The work of Jenner, Röntgen, Anichkov, and Wilkins was largely experimental, and the idea came from Harvey. Was there any chance or luck in 4 of these 10 discoveries? Well, they say if Anthony Leeuwenhoek's rainwater had not happened to stand for several days in an open container, no bacteria would have proliferated in the water for him to discover with his microscope. So that was chance. Crawford Long, who we spoke about last night, would never have found ether as a superb anesthetic if one morning he had not remembered that the night before he had grievously bruised his limbs while enjoying an ether party. Strangely feeling no pain at the time, he injured himself. Okay, the role of chance or luck in these discoveries. Would X-rays have been discovered if William Röntgen had not, solely by chance, glanced at a tiny scrap of material lying near his Crookes tube and detected its fluorescence? This reminds me of Madame Curie, who took a walk to the lab, who decided to take a walk to her lab with her husband. When she got there, she said to him, "Don't turn on the lights." And she saw the fluorescence. For Alexander Fleming, luck in the discovery of the antibacterial potency of penicillin came when a tiny spore of penicillium fell into a petri dish that had been inoculated with, and this is by chance again, a bacterium which is susceptible to the inhibitory action of penicillin. And had he not taken a vacation at the time, he did, and had there not been a heat wave in London, none of this would have happened. So there's a lot of chance here. Okay. Did location, culture, or government play a role in enabling these discoveries? So 4 of the 10 discoveries occurred in Britain, 2 in the USA and Holland, and 1 each in Germany and Russia. 5 of the 10 countries were governed by kings or emperors holding absolute power, so that didn't make any difference to scientific thinking. No ruler subsidized any of the work, but gave gifts to the scientists after the discoveries were made. The other 5 were made in democratic countries, Britain and the USA. One of the science's major discoveries, nuclear fission, was made in Hitler's Germany in 1939. 7 of the discoveries were made in universities or medical schools, and 3 of them, Jenner, Leeuwenhoek, and Long, were made in non-academic environments. Okay. Were the discoverers geniuses? No. Ample talent, but not genius. None of them possess that kind of intellectual power which has the appearance of proceeding from an incomprehensible inspiration and which seems to arrive at its results in an inexplicable, miraculous manner. The work of Harvey or Jenner does not elicit the awe one gets on hearing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, seeing Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, or Michelangelo's Pieta, or reading Max Planck's first description of quantum theory. Do you agree with that? Do you agree with that? I think they're selling our scientists short here. Okay. But more than chance, you needed patience, you needed focus and organization. And Leeuwenhoek, Long, Röntgen, and Fleming had these qualities in abundance, very much like our Madame Curie. If you just take Leeuwenhoek, he was even more curious than Harvey. He inspected not only rainwater with his microscope, but also the tongue of a hog, horse manure, the lens of a whale, and the eye of a flea. He also examined his own semen and the scrapings of his teeth. I wonder how he got the semen. Okay. Who would the writers like to be with? Okay, so the only one that was alive when they did this book was Maurice Wilkins. and he was withdrawn in melancholy. You remember Maurice Wilkins and the DNA story. Vesalius was too cantankerous and egotistical. Harvey was unfriendly and liked being alone. Harvey was boring to Yale students and socially austere. Leeuwenhoek's life outside microscopy was selling dry goods, so he was a bore. Röntgen was an abominable speaker and antisocial. Anichkov looked grim in his photos. Fleming was boring. Their choice, they wanted to be with Edward Jenner. He would have vacationed with us and realized that we were not interested in his work on cowpox. So he'll talk about his discovery of coronary disease, or time with his mentor, John Hunter, or the seasonal migration of English songbirds, or his beloved cuckoos, or play his violin or flute, or take us for a ride in his carriage with its 2 fine horses, or in his hydrogen balloon through his beloved Berkeley countryside. This seemed to be the only all-rounder in the group. That was Edward Jenner, smallpox and vaccination, equally curious about the cause of angina pectoris and the habits and the anatomy of cuckoo nestling, which won him admission to the Royal Society. So it wasn't vaccination that won him. It was the anatomy of the cuckoo nestling. And finally, nobody actually mentioned the clone and Ian Wilmot and Dolly. And the reason why, the authors say, is that it could only happen through the discovery of DNA in tissue culture. So it wouldn't have been that original. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you've stuck with me through thick and thin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I really, sorry?
These earlier people, 4 million, they were terrified of the church, mainly.
No.
My niece is a young doctor, and she says when I ask her why people don't explain things to their doctors so that the doctors can stop it from happening, she says because Southern Africa is ruled by fear.
Yeah.
And they won't tell you because they might get somebody in their street into trouble that sold them the poison.
Oh, okay.